Welcome to the Prophecy Club. Our topic today is Weapons of the New World Order by Nick Begich. Nick Begich discusses the latest developments in technology and its impact on humanity, freedom, human dignity, sovereign individuality, and self-determination. His topics are the HAARP Project, the revolution in military affairs and its impact on freedom, non-lethal weapons and their use and impact on people, such as radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic pulse, extremely low frequency fields, lasers and chemicals, environmental and weather control, new technologies which will eliminate privacy, militarization of law enforcement. Now, you can watch this and others available at watchprophecyclub.com. We've got over 300 DVDs up there, about 2.5 hours each, all for a gift of just $20 a month or $200 a year. Unsubscribe anytime you want to. WatchProphecyClub.com. 300 plus recordings, $20 a month, $200 a year. Go check it out. And also, Prophecy Club is in a jam right now, and if God has blessed you and you could help us, we would really, really appreciate it. Also, Leslie and I are going to minister in Honduras, so we'd appreciate your prayers, and also cutting these 2.5 hour recordings into these daily programs. Your support for that would be very welcome and appreciated also. If you don't want to lose your life's savings, if you have an IRA or a 401k, the thing to do is call 800-200-GOLD. 800-200-GOLD. These folks are Christians and they specialize in helping people not lose their life savings in the event of a stock market crash and things like that. Look, most of the 401ks, most of the IRAs are in paper, backed by paper, and as Lindsey Williams says, if it's in paper, it's worth the paper it's written on. You can lose it all. 1-800-200-GOLD. 800-200-GOLD. Hey, give them a call. Doesn't hurt, doesn't cost you anything. See if they can give you some good advice.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. The topic of tonight's talk is Weapons of the New World Order. Our speaker is an international speaker and author, and he's going to give you an update on HAARP, spelled H-A-A-R-P. The HAARP Project. He's going to be talking about the dysfunction of our military, weapons of the New World Order, things like radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic pulse, extremely low frequency, lasers, chemicals, weather control, militarization of all law enforcement, and new technologies that will eliminate what little privacy we have left. Will you help me welcome Dr. Nick Begich?
Thank you all for being here, and I'll give you a little bit additional background on myself and sort of how I got involved in these issues. And then we'll talk about an update on the HAARP issues and then kind of go from there with the latest material that we've developed. My father was a state senator and later a United States congressman. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. My area of interest in that field was electrophysiology, which is the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human body, which is what attracted me to these issues to begin with. Because we're really talking about new technologies, a variety of technologies that people need to be aware of that really are the new direction in which wars will be fought in the future. Some of that we've even seen in the most recent conflicts. But let's talk a little bit about the HAARP Project and sort of where that is and what that is for those that may not have heard about it. HAARP is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, which is a joint project of the United States Air Force and Navy. It operates in Alaska. And when I first ran into this, it was in a very short article, 5-column-inch article, dealing with that issue, and it was in an Australian journal. Now, I live in Alaska, which is a vast region, but at the same time, it's a very small population. We have only 600,000 people in Alaska, so you tend to be on top of issues that are happening around you. My family's very political, which even makes it more so. We tend to stay on top of what's happening within our region. And reading about the HAARP Project, the first thing that struck me is it seemed quite unbelievable. The technology that was being expressed in that article, what it was being asserted to be able to do, Quite frankly, I didn't believe it when I first read it. But my habit is when you read something that's really startling is you go and you check it out and see what's really there. And we're very fortunate in my part of the world, in Anchorage, Alaska, we have one of the federal depositories for federal records, which means that our community library has to produce any federal document that isn't classified if somebody wants it. So it's kind of a nice resource for a researcher when you can go in and ask for virtually anything and they've got to produce it. Now, if it's not there on microfilm, they round it up for us and move it into the library so we can see that material. And there's actually, I think, a little over 70 of those libraries around the country, so they're not very, very common. Likewise, we have extensive microfilm files, and one of those sets of microfilms were the US patents, which were the first place that I went to look, because this technology was asserting a lot of different things, and it was built around what at least appeared in that first article, 3 patents. What we found is there were actually 9 patents surrounding the technology. There were a number of government documents that were public documents, the documents that led to the contract to build the facility, as well as the environmental impact statements, which are required on all major projects. Now, what did that first article say that was so startling? First of all, they were talking about one instrument, the HAARP instrument, and this is a radio frequency transmitter. And it's most of the time when you think of radio frequency energy, you think of energy coming off of a transmitter and dissipating very rapidly the further that you get away from the transmitter itself. That's why when you get away from radio stations, the signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker until eventually it disappears. With HAARP, they had figured out a way to focus that radio frequency energy, to concentrate it into a relatively small area. And they do this by using a field of antennas, and this field of antennas are fired in a very specific way. And what that causes is the radio frequency energy to go into what's called cyclotron resonance, which can be pictured as sort of a corkscrewing motion that focuses the energy and moves it high up above the atmosphere into an area called the ionosphere. Now, the ionosphere starts about 30 miles above the Earth's surface. It extends for several hundred miles out from there. This is what's responsible for shortwave broadcast, for instance, being able to be heard around the world, because it skips off of that. It bounces the signal off of the ionosphere. It's very important for communications, both civilian and military, which is one of the reasons the military really wanted to study the ionosphere, to figure out, for instance, right now we're in a solar cycle that disturbs the ionosphere from time to time and causes our communications to not work the way they're supposed to. Radio stations go out, or telecommunication systems don't work smoothly. So the more that we learn about the ionosphere, the more efficient we can manage our communications, as well as if we could ever figure out, and this is what the meat of HAARP is about, how to manipulate the ionosphere to create the ideal circumstance to make sure we can carry our communication. That became a compelling interest to the military. At the same time, being able to disturb the ionosphere in a way that would deny, say, our adversaries the ability to communicate. So that was the first major area the military had an interest in terms of the HAARP instrument, because here was an instrument that on the ground could focus a tremendous amount of energy up, and then by manipulating that energy, controlling it in very specific ways, a number of weapon effects are possible. And I'm just going to kind of go through some of those quickly because I really want to get on to the new material. But first of all, the first thing was communications. Disrupting communications and carrying our own was one of the big objectives. Along that line, one of the things that was important was the idea of being able to utilize the system for communicating with submarines when they're deep under the oceans. Now, high-frequency signals cannot pass through the ground or the sea very far, so you can't communicate under most communication modes to submarines. So what they use is in Michigan and Wisconsin and on the Aleutian Chain and a number of other places around the world, they have 14 to 26 mile long antennas that are buried under the ground that create a signal called an ELF, an extremely low frequency signal. This is a long wave that penetrates the earth and sea and can be used for communication with a submarine. Now with HAARP, instead of having antennas buried under the ground, by pulsing the signal, vibrating that signal, modulating that signal, this high frequency signal, they can actually cause the ionosphere to begin to vibrate in sympathy. And what that does is convert up to a 1,000-mile long portion of the ionosphere into a broadcast antenna that sends an extremely low frequency signal back through the earth and sea. So they actually convert something that God created to do one thing. They convert it from essentially DC current to AC, alternating pulsing current. This then acts as an antenna, sends that energy down, and they can use it for communications. Now, one of the other things that the military uses the same mode of operations for, in fact, in 1996, it's what the Congress appropriated the money for. They said you can't have any more money unless you prove that you can use this technology for one of their claims, which was called earth-penetrating tomography. In very simple language, what that means in the vernacular would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep. And this was right after the Gulf War, and everybody's running around looking for the underground nuclear facilities and the chemical and biological plants that we suspected were in Iraq. So this became the priority for the Senate. They wanted to see whether or not this technology could really be used in that way. As a result, they tested that application, they proved that it could work effectively, and they got their money for that year and subsequent years. And it was actually funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of the defense budget in that year. Now, another application along the same line is this is creating what's called an ELF, extremely low frequency signal. I'm going to get back to that concept as we go on tonight because there's some other side effects to that we're going to need to discuss. But so we've got communications and we've got earth-penetrating tomography, or X-raying the Earth in the vernacular. The next thing that comes out with this technology is its over-the-horizon radar capability. Now, when you think of the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, standard radars were essentially line of sight. They figured out a way to look around the actual curvature of the Earth for incoming objects. Now, the old technology, as objects came close in, they became highly distorted because the technology wasn't sophisticated enough to keep that distortion from occurring. At the same time, you could pick up things from a very high elevation, but things like a cruise missile wouldn't show up on the old over-the-horizon radar technology. With HAARP, you see everything from ionospheric levels, which is where intercontinental ballistics missiles carrying nuclear warheads would be coming in from, all the way down to cruise missile heights. So essentially you see everything. You don't get distortion coming close in, and you can see around the curvature of the Earth. So over-the-horizon radar. Now, taking that to the next step, when you create the energy field that allows you the over-the-horizon radar capability, if you increase the power slightly, every object coming in has a signature, an energy signature around it. Now, with satellite-based technologies, and there's a patent dealing with this in this cluster of patents, you can actually deduce which of those incoming objects are carrying nuclear payloads. Because when they carry nuclear payloads, they have a very unique signature, an electromagnetic signature that shows up. Now, given that, the way they always envisioned a nuclear attack was a threat cloud would come in, and this would mean that you'd have as many as 100,000 incoming objects. And the idea was that a few hundred or maybe 1,000 would carry nuclear payloads. And the idea was you overwhelm your enemy so that they target everything and some of them get through. And this was the whole idea around having way more missiles than we needed to destroy the Earth. I don't know how many times before they started to disarm some of them, but also to overwhelm with decoys so that you could always be able to get some through. But if you can figure out where the real threat is, I mean, granted, the ones that are not nuclear armed still create damage, but if you could take out those with nuclear payloads, you reduce the amount of damage that would take place on U.S. soil. Going the next step, if you increase the energy even more in this over-the-horizon mode, you can create what's called an electromagnetic pulse. Now, this is a surge of energy that allows for the interference with the avionics, the things that control the flight path, the onboard computers controlling these sophisticated missiles, causes them to malfunction, and the crafts crash. Now, electromagnetic pulse was first discovered, and some will remember this, back when they were doing the atomic tests in the South Pacific, and they had blasted one off of the ocean quite a distance up from the ground. But what it did is it created this surge of energy that knocked out power in Hawaii for a couple hours. And this was back in 1962, 63, right around in that time frame. And the government started looking at that and saying, if we could create a surge of energy, maybe without atomics or nuclear blasts, maybe we can use this to disrupt communication. And many will remember hearing the warning that if we ever had a nuclear attack and just one went off far enough up above the United States, it would knock out all the electronics across the country, everything from toaster ovens to sophisticated computers. And that's what they were talking about, this electromagnetic pulse capability. But now with this instrument, you have the ability to artificially create it without the nuclear fallout, which is quite advantageous from a military perspective. At the same time, some other things came up with HAARP, the idea of transferring energy from one point on the planet to another. In other words, focusing this radio frequency energy up into the ionosphere, bouncing it off of reflectors, and then reconfiguring it on some other part of the planet into electrical energy. Because what you have is essentially, to get from A to B, you get natural gas or some fuel source that converts to electricity, converts to radio frequency, goes through the antenna array, bounces off, comes back as radio frequency, and then gets converted back into electrical energy. Now, they believe that that idea actually is economic around 2004 for some parts of the world that don't have ready supplies of energy. But in a battle situation where you need a lot of energy and the battlefield environment, you can see what the interest would be. Now, the problem with that one is, any of you ever done any carpentry work, you know that if you're like got a 40-foot room across and you get a 1/16 of an inch out at one end, you know, you start getting several inches out on the other. Well, figure that out in terms of something on the ground and something many, many miles above the Earth's surface. If you're slightly out, or you get a solar wind that knocks the reflector slightly out, you've got this blast of energy running through your neighborhood instead of where it's intended to go. So that's a bit of a problem, and one that I don't think can easily be overcome, but nonetheless, it was one of the things within this cluster of patents. Now, Bernard Eastland, Dr. Bernard Eastland, was the inventor of the primary patents dealing with this technology. He was also the person that put together the original teams for this project. And Dr. Eastland had a couple of other ideas. One of them is that using the same array, you could actually change the chemical composition of the upper atmosphere by creating chemical reactions using this instrument. For instance, he suggested you'd be able to increase ozone, increase the ozone available in the ozone layer as an example, or knock out specific pollutants in the upper atmosphere, which from my perspective, as a matter of, of national interest, it certainly would seem that that would be one, if the story is true about ozone depletion being this big villain, we would certainly want to see develop. But unfortunately, that is not on the planning blocks for the military, although it is in the original patents. One of the other things Dr. Eastland pointed out was the idea that this instrument might be used for weather modification, actually changing weather patterns over a large geographic area. Now, since our original work was published, an additional paper was prepared by Dr. Eastland for the European Space Agency, which is the European equivalent to NASA. Now, that paper was to look at a HAARP-type instrument specifically for manipulating weather patterns. And he completed that work. They actually modeled this concept at the University of Oklahoma. And it's interesting, when they modeled it at the University of Oklahoma, do you remember a few years ago when the tornadoes whipped through that area? Created huge damage, and then President Clinton showed up on the scene, and one of the things he said at the University of Oklahoma was, "Don't worry, we're going to figure out a way to depress the energy in these tornadoes." And everyone kind of laughed it off. Well, 2 months before is when Bernard Eastland finished his modeling to do exactly that, and that was done for the European Space Agency. In fact, it was a very well received paper, and he's got a follow-on contract that just came in on that project. The idea that you can use this system for that kind of activity, for some people will say, well, wouldn't that be great to be able to knock out a tornado threatening a city? The problem is the energy has to go somewhere. It just doesn't disappear. Energy has to go somewhere. And the problem is you can't adequately model where that energy is going. And this is one of the big problems. When you think about ways in which HAARP can be used for weather modification, let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is when you, well, let me go back a little bit. The earlier versions of the HAARP instruments were called by the military ionospheric heaters, because they could heat up a portion of the ionosphere. And in so doing, an area, for instance, above HAARP can be heated about 30 miles in diameter. It then lifts up, because it's heated, it lifts up, and it can lift up, instead of being 30 miles above the Earth's surface, they can push it out to be a couple hundred miles above the Earth's surface within that area. All that lower atmosphere then moves in to fill that empty space. And when it does, it alters the pressure systems below. If there's a jet stream in the neighborhood, it has a tremendous impact on where that jet stream is going to go. In other words, it changes within our region of Alaska over a very large area a tremendous amount of weather. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the country? Well, if you watch the 6 o'clock news, you realize that a lot of weather originates in Alaska, having a profound effect on Canada and the United States. And what we know from our observations of El Nino and El Nina, that when you have weather, and those are big anomalies, those are huge anomalies, but when you have weather in one place, it has a profound effect around the planet. In fact, there's a principle in physics, and it's basically the butterfly effect, which was an old theory that goes, if a butterfly is flapping its wings in one part of the planet, it can create a hurricane in another. And the way this was done, figured out, was somebody made a very, very slight mathematical error in a computation. And as they compounded out the computation, it had a geometric effect. In other words, a small amount of energy at one point created a huge change in the outcome on the other. And this is how this was discovered, and then it's been proven in a number of laboratory settings that this theory, the butterfly effect, is actually quite real. The point is, what we know about weather modification, we can go back a little bit in history. In 1977, the United States, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and 60 other countries signed a treaty where we agreed not to use weather modification as a weapon of war. Now, that's a long time ago. Now, anyone who watched CNN today, and it's April in 2000, saw that we're just now seeing the or actually the Russians signing off on START 2, one of the disarmament treaties for nuclear weapons. A few years ago, we remember hearing about the sign-off on the chemical and biological, yet 23 years ago, we signed off on geophysical manipulation and weather modification, because that's where the technology was then. It had advanced to the point where countries realized that if we moved forward in this area, we would have serious, serious consequences. One of the other things that came up with weather modification generally, there's a couple of things. I'll read a very short quote, and this kind of puts it in perspective. This is from Secretary of Defense William Cohen, who's our current Secretary of Defense, and he made this quote in April 1997 at the University of Georgia, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climates, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now, that's our current Secretary of Defense commenting on the state of the technology. And he's commenting on three areas: climate, earthquakes, and volcanoes using an electromagnetic system. In other words, not cloud seeding, not chemicals, not blasts causing faults to go, but electromagnetic waves. And he's accrediting terrorist organizations with this capability. Now, in the context of our latest book, Earthrising the Revolution, we document very carefully. There's over 650 source documents that were quoted here, and each of them are footnoted. So when I make a statement, you can look at where it came from on the same page as it's written, and you can see where it came from. And most of our material is either U.S. patents, military records, academic studies, or mainstream media reports. And this material was derived from 80 boxes of archival material, reduced to 12, reduced to the 650 best sources to lay out our case. And when you think of weather mod, and you think about the fact that we're really just starting to gain an understanding of how these systems interact, and what they're finding is that underlying all these systems ultimately is energy. And as we talk tonight, we're going to be talking a lot about energy in terms of how it affects both human health and hardware or machinery. And when we think about physical matter, you can think about it in these terms: energy, atoms, molecules, chemicals and compounds, and eventually the physical manifestation of physical form. And that's pretty much the way it rolls. And what we're talking about is things that affect it at an energetic level, that have a roll-up effect through all living systems and non-living systems in terms of their composition and effect. What we're also finding is the interest in changing geophysical outcomes, in other words, what's happening in the planet naturally, by man-made means. And I really want to read a couple of verses that I think are relevant to put some of this into perspective. And I think it's important to put this in perspective. And I want to first go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And you know what it's really talking about, and it goes on into 28, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And in those 3 verses, you know, we find out who we are. We find out what our responsibility is, which is stewardship over this planet. And there's an important verse I'm going to read in a second, but before I get there, I want to read from chapter 2 in Genesis, verse 7, and it said, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And what strikes me before I go to the next verse is that first we're created in the image of the Creator, which I think is phenomenal. I mean, that's phenomenal from my perspective. I think it should be from everyone's. But does that mean that the Creator, that God looks like each one of us? I don't think so, because in the next chapter is where he then breathes life and man became a living soul. In other words, it kind of makes you wonder, what were we before? And I believe it's underneath that energy. We were something underneath that energy. Energy is something we measure in the physical world. Underneath that, I think, is where the real image, where the image of the Creator is. And when you go back and you go forward, and I like to go to the end and the beginning, you know, I'm kind of one of those people that reads the beginning and reads the end. But when you go through all of the stuff in the middle, it's sort of the story of how we sort of lost touch with who we are, you know, and what inheritance we really had. Christ had to come back and remind us. God had to actually show up and say, hey, let me get your attention here. Let me tell you what you really are and what your capabilities are. And then a lot of things started to happen. But then towards the end of the book, and this is really important, because you know, I deal with a lot of environmental organizations in the United States, and I have a lot of heartburn with a lot of these organizations because their agenda seems a little bit more than stewardship. In fact, a lot more than stewardship, and I don't agree with the rest of that agenda. But stewardship I agree with, and I think it's confirmed in chapter 11 of Revelations, verse 18, and it says, and the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come in the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward to thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth. Sounds like there's a big price to pay if we don't pay attention. And we're talking about weather modification, man playing God. I think there's a big price to pay in the end. That's just before Armageddon and the rest of the bad news begins. And I think when we look at sort of the whole responsibility aspect of who we are, what our responsibility is, it really drives the point home that we can't ignore the place that we expect our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to live. By the same token, it's in balance with the fact that the earth is supposed to also serve us in the sense of providing for us. And God gave it to us for that reason. But let's talk about sort of what happens when man plays God in terms of weather. Some of the things that come out, and the idea and some of the things that have been pointed out, is the idea that man can modify the ionosphere, which has a direct effect on communications, also a direct effect on weather systems as we're learning. In fact, a few years ago, people remember that above lightning storms, there was this energy that went up, and they were called sprites, and this energy had never been known before. And they still can't figure out exactly what role it plays in our weather systems. But what is being found out is that it's under all of this, that if you affect the energy of the system, you can have profound effects throughout the system. And again, this becomes somewhat problematic. Let's talk about the earth-penetrating tomography aspect in line with the thing I just read from Secretary of Defense Cohen. The idea that you could trigger an earthquake, how would that work? This is kind of interesting. There was a friend of ours, Brooks Agnew. He's a really good guy in earth-penetrating tomography. And what he found using 30 watts of energy, about half the energy that you have in a household light bulb, using 30 watts of energy, he was able to send that energy into the earth by hitting the resonant frequency that harmonized with the natural energy of the earth. And what it allowed is for that energy to go into the earth several kilometers deep, and a certain amount of it gets reflected back. And that reflected energy is what gets measured to determine what's under the ground. This is how earth-penetrating tomography works. But if you crank the volume up, the amount of energy going in, he believes, and I believe it's borne out by the research that we've done, that you can trigger a release of energy in a nonlinear way. Now let me give you an example of what that means. Let's say from here to Paris, we stacked up dominoes, starting with a regular domino, and we increased their size by 1% from here to Paris. So by the time it gets to Paris, you got a domino about the size of the Eiffel Tower. Now if we hit the first one with a ½ an ounce weight, eventually they all tumble over and the one that's in Paris crushes the Eiffel Tower. Now it's not the ½ ounce weight. It was the ½ ounce weight that triggered the event that capitalized on gravitational energy, energy that was already there. It just acted like the primer on a bullet, releasing that energy. What's been found out about HAARP is the same thing can occur in the upper ionosphere. In fact, if you broadcast energy in the very low frequency range, that energy, when it hits the top of the ionosphere, where the next layer begins, it actually amplifies by up to 1,000 times. Now that's tremendous because HAARP, when it finishes its first stage, will have an effective radiated power of 1 billion watts, according to the military record. 1 billion watts. Now imagine that being amplified by 1,000 times, or whatever portion of that energy you could actually deliver into that upper portion of the ionosphere. Tremendous nonlinear effects would then be possible. The kinds of effects that could trigger these geophysical events that we're reading about. Now the other part that comes in is you can go back a little bit further. There was a gentleman by the name of J.F. Gordon MacDonald. He wrote a chapter in a book called Unless Peace Comes. The chapter was How to Wreck Your Environment. This was written in 1969. That was before the environmental movement because it would have probably been unpopular, and it was quite a popular book at the time. But he was a geophysicist at UCLA, and he was also an advisor, a science advisor to President Lyndon Johnson when he was in the presidency. And what he suggested was all of these things were possible if we could ever figure out the triggering mechanisms. And those triggering mechanisms are exactly the state of the technology today. We have figured out how to trigger these kinds of events utilizing electromagnetic means. Going a little bit further, one of the other things that J.F. Gordon MacDonald talked about, and one of the other potential uses for HAARP, deals with the impact on the human body and the human mind. And one of the things that we know from the research is extremely low frequency, which is where the brain predominantly operates, can be influenced by external signals. And let me describe some of the background of this, because this is a big part of our current work, and this is going to move us off of the old stuff and onto the new. What we know, and this is again go to J.F. Gordon MacDonald, the science advisor to Johnson, he also said that if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way as to return a signal in the ELF range, extremely low frequency range, we could manipulate the behavior of humans over a large geographic area. But it didn't end with him. In 1971, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages, which is actually, if you read it today, you'd swear it was a history and not a forecast, because it forecasted what would happen in the third world in terms of development. It forecasted the collapse of the former Soviet Union. It forecast the advancement of technologies in terms of how they would affect our economies globally, the change from rural economies to urban economies. All those things were laid out. For those that don't remember, or maybe too young to remember, Zbigniew Brzezinski, that was when he was at Columbia University. He later became National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter when he was president. So he wasn't any slouch. I mean, this guy knew. But on page 54 through 56 of that book, you'll find references to this idea of electronically stroking the ionosphere in just the right way as to manipulate the behavior of human beings over a large geographic area. Now, we can talk a little bit about that because I think it's a real relevant point. I won't go to the quote because it'll take too much time, but there's another quote in the book talking about the use of this very kind of system in 1978, bombarding a signal back into the Soviet Union or the former satellite states to affect the behavior of people operating nuclear power plants, as an example. It's kind of interesting. Shows up in the literature. But let's go back in time a little bit to talk about this whole concept of can you really modify the behavior of human beings? And let's first talk about the science itself. What we know about human brain waves, if you've ever seen an EEG, which gives a little chart, they hook up the electrodes to the head and they produce a little chart and you'll see a little squiggly line. Well, it's measuring your brain rhythms, your predominant brain frequencies. What it's found in that, and in the study of what happens within the human brain, and I'm going to break it down into a few components. I'm going to talk about sort of the good side of this and then the bad news. What happens when you're in deep, deep sleep, your brain activity is operating between 1 and 4 pulses per second. That's when you're in the deepest form of sleep, when you're knocked out cold. The next stage is theta stage, which is between 4 and 7 hertz approximately, pulses per second, cycles per second. I'll use those words interchangeably, but essentially pulses per second. This is the frequency in which most little kids between 3 and 5 years old, this is their predominant brainwave activity. If you think about little kids, you know, they're kind of in a half awake, half asleep sort of place. This is the same place adults are when you're half awake and half asleep, sort of drifting in and out of your dream state, but you're aware. This is where these guys are all the time, which kind of explains why they're sort of half there and half not, and it's hard to get their attention sometimes. But it's also the time when they're learning a tremendous amount. They learn language, social customs. I mean, think about all the things kids learn between 3 and 5. It's pretty phenomenal. But that's where they are until we send them to school and we start messing them up in the public system and dampening that creative talent and spirit that they have. By the time they get out of school, there's about 1% of the population that has any creative capacity of any consequence left, unless you're fortunate enough to recapture it somewhere along the line. It's not very easy to do. But going above that, from say 7 hertz to around 12 hertz, you're in what's called an alpha state. This is a highly creative state. This is where most artists are when they're doing their really good work, when athletes are sort of in the groove, you know, on step. You know, this is the place where things just sort of flow really well. It's interesting to note, there's a gentleman, a German scientist in the 50s, discovered the resonant frequency of the Earth, what the Earth naturally pulses at, and it's 7.83 hertz, which is kind of interesting. It's called Schumann's resonance. What's interesting about that is it correlates to this highly creative state in human beings. Very interesting. But going above that, above 12 hertz, say 12 to 20 hertz is a beta state, which most of us are in. That's where we are right now, unless I put you to sleep, then you're dropping down a little bit. But that's where we generally are, and that's kind of active thinking, active listening. If it gets too high, that's when you get agitated, angry. If you get it real high, you're totally out of control. Now, another important couple factors about the brain that's important to note in terms of brain frequency is when you experience positive emotions, love, joy, happiness, your brain waves are very coherent, very rhythmic, very controlled in that sense. If you're in fear, hate, anger, they're all over the map, which means you cannot make good decisions unless you make them by mistake. Chances are you're not going to make good decisions because that is not the way the brain works. Now, it's interesting when you think about what happens when you're in fear and where fear comes from. It makes a lot of sense in terms of science when you look at it, and in terms of religion when you look at it. Because these things operate under the rules that God created, and they work. Now, at the same time, you know, there's an idea of when 2 or more are gathered in His name, right? Really powerful things happen. You know that when you center around the emotion of love and 2 people look in each other's eyes, which whatever form of love it is, and they focus on each other's eyes, that their brain waves become synchronized, which is very interesting, and this can be actually measured with an EEG. When they become synchronized in resonance, resonance is a formula that goes x plus x squared. In other words, it's more than the sum of the total. Again, it makes perfect sense. Lines right up, science lines right up with what's right here. Now, those are outward manifestations of what happens. Now, if you can interfere with brain activity by external sources of energy, then you can have a tremendous impact on human thinking and emotion. Now, what we have found, and science has found, and I'm going to go back to the work of a gentleman by the name of Jose Delgado, who many of you have probably heard about. Now, Jose Delgado got his degree in electrophysiology from the University of Madrid in 1950. Most people don't even know a degree in electrophysiology exists, much less 50 years ago. But when he finished his work there, he came to the United States. He ended up working at Yale University for almost 30 years. In the 60s, he wrote a book called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. That's kind of an interesting concept. His basic idea was that if we could manipulate the brain activity of human beings, we could basically put us all in this sort of happy, blissful sort of existence. Now, from my perspective, that really violates the very essence of who we are as human beings, because who we are as human beings requires free will, which means we have to be able to freely express our emotions. And anything that interferes with that is something that even God will not do, not just by Christian tradition, but by most major religious traditions. That's what distinguishes us from other creatures. You know, we are the ones with free will, the way to make choices. Now, what Delgado believed and what he tested was, first of all, to map out the brain to see what's going on in the brain. He began implanting electrodes and then stimulating them with electricity to see what would happen. He did that up until the late 60s, even into the 70s. And one of the things he did to sort of demonstrate how powerful this was utilizing these implants in a radio frequency transmitter that kicked the energy in. He had a charging bull coming at him, and then he flipped the switch and it stopped, dead in its tracks, a few feet from him. Now you can see the photograph of it in the book I just referenced, Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. It's kind of interesting. But he continued to work in this area, and he found by mid-1985 that he didn't need to use implants. He didn't even need to use any really high-energy devices. What he found is that energy at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. This is very minute energy. But if you think about the human body, we run on very minute energy when you think about what's going through our nervous system, what's happening within the brain. But at 1/50th, hitting the right frequency, he could change the behavior of humans and primates, monkeys and humans, like turning on and off a light switch from passive to highly aggressive and back. Now, he did this using a pulsed radio frequency signal, which is the stuff of HAARP on the broad scale. On a smaller scale, it was his little lab device. Now, Delgado got pretty excited about it. The military got pretty excited about it. There's a whole series of things that came out of that. The mind control section of our book actually covers almost 30 patents, U.S. patents, that show the evolution of this technology. It covers the military records showing sort of how they saw this technology evolving. And then in addition to that, the academic reports that show the results of testing and experimenting in this field. And then, in some instances, congressional reports condemning its use. Because one of the things that came out in the early 70s, and this was one of those things that kind of struck me. I mean, when we were doing our work, you know, sometimes when you're digging out material, and we dig out a tremendous amount of material, but every once in a while you hit a tough spot where you can't find that thing that you know is out there. And one of these was a project called MK Ultra, which was a CIA project for mind control purposes. It was being developed back in the 60s and 70s. And we heard references in the literature, but never saw that primary document. And this is kind of the way a lot of our research worked. I'm sitting in a book room, a big surplus book room, and I'm talking to this guy, and I'm really frustrated because I want a primary document. I don't want a secondary or a tertiary document. I want something that's right to the heart that no one can argue with. So I'm sitting there and I'm talking to him about this problem. I wanted to find out something that would be primary. And I reach in a box of books, and as I'm telling him this story, I pull out a book, and it's a congressional investigation on the CIA, and inside it is exactly what I was looking for. Now, I give that as an example because it happened all the time, and it still does. I mean, when we need something, if it's relevant to our work, it sort of shows up in the most bizarre ways. And it's kind of a neat thing. You know when you're on the right track when that starts happening, and it happens a lot. Well, the point was, the CIA, during that time, had done a lot of things. CIA, you got to remember, is not supposed to do anything domestic. You know, they're supposed to be out of the country. Well, that's bogus, I can tell you. What they were doing, at that time, they were opening mail. They were infiltrating civil rights groups, anti-war groups. They were also involved in a project, MK Ultra, where they were actually using chemicals such as LSD and other hallucinogenics to influence behavior of people. And they were interested in this because when people came out of the Korean War, kids came back that had been prisoners of war that were just acting really bizarre. And this is when the term brainwashing was first created, and this interest in all of this started. Now, what came out of all that, as you roll up through their work, mainly what came out of the congressional record was strictly chemicals, LSD, hallucinogenics. I mean, in one instance, 8,000 service personnel were given LSD to see what would happen. You know, I mean, think about this. You know, this is our government with people already charged with being responsible to defend us in the event of war, and we're getting them stoned on LSD to see what would happen. Now, the idea, they thought, was if we could figure out how to modify behavior, maybe we could eliminate fear, you know, so when people go into combat, they wouldn't be afraid. Maybe we could enhance capacity or limit the capacity of an adversary. And this was their big thrust. But everyone thought, as they went through this, and thousands of records were shredded at the time, people responsible for that got in a lot of trouble, not enough trouble from my perspective. But the fact of the matter was, the real meat of the issue, we always believed, and recently, and we show it in the book, we found that it was in fact true. Electromagnetic means were also being experimented with as far back as 1960. This is a long time ago, 40 years ago, a generation ago. And in that, what we found is through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, that there was a large body of data surrounding this. And then when we started looking at the patent record for what had evolved between 1960s and the current time, we found all of these things, not just for behavior, which is emotional state, but we found that utilizing very little energy, according to Delgado's work and a number of patents, that you could in fact move the emotional state of human beings. Now when you go a little bit further, the idea comes in, well, what else could you do if you could manipulate this energy, and what other forms could you use to do this? Now one of the things that many people will remember, a couple of years ago there was a cartoon in Japan, Pokemon was being played, and 700 kids had epileptic seizures from seeing the flashing light on the cartoon. Now I want to explain this principle because it's a very important principle for understanding how energy systems, energy weapons work. When you take a carrier, and let me explain this, let's look at a couple of analogies. First of all, let's consider the modulation, that pulse rate that was carried in that cartoon. Let's call that the information. Now that information you can put, say, in a box and put it on a train, plane, or automobile, and the information's still the same, still arrives at the same destination. You open the box and there's the information. In terms of electromagnetic carriers, we can use flashing light, we can use a television, we can use a radio, we can use anything that carries an electromagnetic signal, even the current flowing around this room. If we can modulate, vibrate, pulse that energy in the right way, that's the information. That's what's in the little box. So you can carry it in a number of ways. In fact, I'll give you a couple of examples right out of some literature that's pretty interesting. This came out of an article that was in a magazine, or actually a publication by the U.S. Army War College, and then also out of a publication from one of the Russian Army leading journals called Orienteer. And I'll just read a couple of these just to give you a sort of a flavor for what I'm talking about. A psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal. Another one, a nervous system generator which is designed to paralyze the central nervous system of insects. The same system is being refined to have the same effect on human beings. Another one, and this one's kind of interesting, ultrasonic signals of very specific design have been created. These devices are supposedly capable of carrying out bloodless internal operations without leaving a mark on the skin. And they can also be used to kill. And another one, and this is a real interesting one, the 25th frame effect is a technique where every 25th frame of a movie reel or video footage contains a message that is picked up by the subconscious so as to alter the conscious mind. That same 25th frame effect can be instilled through computer networks and delivered via the internet. Now you're worrying about pornography, good thing to worry about. Worry about some of the other technologies in terms of that carrier. Because when you think about the internet as an unregulated, unfiltered source of information, the 25th frame effect, this idea of carrying signals on internet transmissions, is very, very possible. Technology exists to do it, and we cite a number of patents that point that out quite clearly. In terms of radio, like radio broadcasts that you hear, you know, back during the Gulf War, we suspected for a long time that something else was going on there beyond the conventional weaponry. And the thing is, as our sort of rule of thumb, in fact it is our rule of thumb, if you can't prove it and you can't produce documents to prove it, you just don't say it. Because there's plenty out there. If there's 100 items in the plate and 80 of them you can prove, stick to the 80. The other 20, either time will prove are not correct or time will give you the information that evidences them. And this is very important because when we go out and we talk about this, we need to be equipped to deliver that source material. The people we tell need to be equipped, so when they're challenged by people with more technical backgrounds or scientific backgrounds or political backgrounds, that they can point authoritatively to those sources and say, it's not my words, it's your words, and point to those military records, point to those US patents, point to those academic studies that lay out that case. because I think that's equipping people properly. And it also serves to dissipate a lot of the fear when you replace fear with real knowledge, and then you act on that knowledge in a responsible way. That's a very important thing, because fear, I think, really comes from the wrong place. You know, I mean, it's not a matter of generating fear, it's a matter of generating hope. I mean, the purpose of prophecy is to warn us. It's not to condemn us, it's to warn us about what might be coming, but at the same time, to sort of say, look, if, you know, you change your behavior, you change what you're doing, maybe the time won't come tomorrow, maybe it'll be put off. And I can say that, you know, I think pretty confidently that for the last 2,000 years, people have been saying, this is it, it's all over. And we're still here 2,000 years later. Maybe this is it, maybe it is all over, but the fact of the matter is, we're not called to hide in a hole, we're called to step out and act on what we know to be right and true.
What you've been watching here is us cutting a 2.5-hour DVD into 30-minute segments, but you can watch all of it at watchprophecyclub.com, where you can watch some 300 other DVDs, 2.5 hours each, $20 a month or $200 a year at watchprophecyclub.com, watchprophecyclub.com. And Prophecy Club is in a bit of a financial jam right now, so if you can help us, if God has blessed you, if you feel like Prophecy Club has blessed you, then we could really use your help. Thank you. We've got a new sponsor. It's sat123.com. Sat123.com. I'm amazed at what this company offers. They got satellite phones. They've got Wi-Fi hotspots where you can have internet any place. So suitcase nukes go off in your city. If you don't have to worry about that, you still have electricity, it can go right up and connect to a satellite. They also have marine satellite internet. They also have satellite radios so that you can talk back and forth, even though, in other words, it's not a phone, it's a radio, but it's satellite. So go check it out, satellite123.com. And if you use the promo code PROPHECY, there are several different kinds of discounts.